Anyone who's taken a family photo knows that it's no easy thing to do. Of course, there's the trouble of finding a time when everyone's free, and then, if you're like my family, making sure people's outfits don't clash. And then there's the business of crowding everyone together in the frame, something that's hard with a large family. But as anyone knows, the hardest thing of all about taking a family photo is trying to get everyone to smile at the same time. Usually there's at least one person who decides to blink at just the wrong moment, and then it's back to everyone trying to smile again. Of course, the longer this goes on, the less genuine it feels. It begins to feel less and less like an authentic picture of family life, and more like trying to pretend to be a big, happy family. Well, no matter how many chances Joseph and his brothers would be given, I don't think they could manage a single smiling photo. The snapshot from Genesis is certainly not happy. Joseph has just come from crying, his eyes are probably bloodshot, and his 11 brothers, now that's a large family, are all open-mouthed. They're surprised, shocked, afraid even to find that Joseph, who they'd taken for dead, is standing there alive in front of them. Of course, Joseph had been sold into slavery into Egypt by his brothers, and then passed off as dead to his father. And for several chapters in this narrative, he's been hiding his identity, pretending he doesn't speak their language, and using, no doubt, some good Egyptian costumes to cover up his familiar face. He's been trying to find out if his brothers have changed, and at the same time, he's been trying to find out news about his father, how he's doing. But in this moment, the climax of the narrative, Joseph finally comes clean. You can sense the tension in the moment. His brothers worried that maybe he's out for revenge, even as he assures them of his forgiveness. But then something shifts, and Joseph embraces his brothers. They weep on one another's shoulders. It's not exactly a happy family photo, but it is a rare picture of reconciliation in a distinctly dysfunctional family. And in that respect, Joseph and his brothers are in good company. Genesis is full of dysfunctional families. It's a bit of a puzzle, really. Genesis is the prologue to the story of Israel, and yet it's clearly a very messy story. Whereas most origin stories tend to mythologize their founders, or at least put them in the best light, Genesis gives a very frank picture of dysfunctional family. Well, there are the usual problems: sibling rivalries, fights for inheritance, marital disputes, infertility, adultery. But from Cain and Abel onward, there's also an unusual level of dysfunction: murder, incest, theft, war. If Joseph and his brothers aren't exactly a happy family, they might be able to blame their forebears. So we'd be right to wonder why exactly we have such a messy picture of family life standing at the first part of the Bible. Why keep such an unflattering portrait on the mantelpiece, so to speak? Well, it is rather unflattering, especially in comparison with some of the pictures our own culture has of family life. Family fun, family friendly, fun for the whole family. Clearly, this is a word with positive connotations in public life. We're expected to have warm and fuzzy associations with the word. And of course, sometimes we do, but not all the time. Some of the most familiar elements of family life are left out when we Photoshop the messy bits away. The friction of disagreement, the hurts that are inevitably given and received. For many of us, family is the place that we first came to know how to give and receive love, but for many it's also the place we're first disappointed, where scars sometimes form, not always metaphorical. Even in families that are generally healthy, free from domination or abuse, there's still the hard work of living with other people. We might say that there's more to the picture than any family photo. So perhaps one of the reasons Genesis casts such an unflattering light on these families is that the author is simply less anxious about the mess that comes with relating with others. It can be a relief to see dysfunction pictured so plainly. But reading through the story once more, I was struck by just how dramatic it is. The author lays it on pretty thick. And I think there's a reason for this, what really seems to be caricature of family life. It's written right there in the text. Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant evil in selling me into slavery, but the whole time God has been working for good." In a few words, he captures the whole drama of the book of Genesis. Human depravity on the one hand, and divine capability. The dysfunction of Joseph and his brothers is there to highlight God's ability to make a people out of rather unpromising material. We might look to the pages of the New Testament for a little more detail. For one of the really odd things about Jesus' preaching, at least to his contemporaries, was the way he called God Father. In all the Gospels, Jesus is doing this, and in all the Gospels, he's getting into trouble for it. Of course, we're used to this language, so it may not strike us as particularly odd, but to his contemporaries, it sounded, if not just presumptuous, but blasphemous. It must have been unsettling to hear this wandering teacher talk about God the way a child might talk about her parent. Well, you can see an example in the gospel passage for today. It's probably the best known of Jesus' sermons, and it's the rather shocking part where he tells his followers to love their enemies. But don't miss the bit about family there. Children resemble their parents, Jesus points out. To resemble God, we ought to be as generous as he is. The unmerited mercy he extends ought to find an echo in our behavior. And that, of course, is the clue to Jesus' own intimacy with God. For at the end of St. Luke's Gospel, the one our passage comes from, Jesus does precisely what he's told his followers to do. From the cross, he cries out to the Father and says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Like Father, like Son. And that might add something to the way we read the story of Joseph. The first Christians often read Israel's stories in the light of the story of Jesus, perhaps in the same way that a child looking through an old photo album might think that a picture of her great-grandmother was in fact a picture of her mother. In the same way, the early church often pictured Jesus in the faces of the figures of the Old Testament. And so they read Joseph's story in just this way. Hadn't he too been betrayed by those who knew him? And hadn't his followers failed to recognize him after he appeared to them again? Hadn't he offered forgiveness to his betrayers? Hadn't he said that what they had meant for evil, God had meant for good? Perhaps most striking of all in these similarities is the way that like Joseph, Jesus called those who had betrayed him family. And even more than Joseph, Jesus claimed that all people could enjoy the same relationship he had with the one he called Father. Well, that is the family of faith, the church. And most of us know that it's not free from the dysfunctions that plagued Joseph and his brothers or the other families of Genesis. And yet, it's also true that in this family, we find moments like Joseph of reconciliation. We find even sometimes that we mistake a brother or a sister for the face of Jesus himself. And so for this family and for our adoption into it, may God's name be praised. Amen.